So that's why I think sometimes you look at the ROI, especially in public sector, the ROI is not so clear. Is there a massive financial return? I mean, how do you put a financial return on somebody who says, actually, thank you for coming to check on me, who's elderly, living by themselves?
Welcome to a new episode of Engines of Creation. Today, we are venturing into the world of local authorities and discovering how innovation can transform cities into better places to live. Our guest is Gurpreet Muctor, Chief Data and Technology Officer of Westminster City Council, a true pioneer who is leading the digital transformation in London. We'll explore how his team is using technology and data to improve services for citizens, with a special focus on human-centered design and co-creation. Get ready to discover concrete examples of innovation, such as the Report It app that uses artificial intelligence to simplify problem reporting by citizens. Don't miss this episode full of insights for those working in the public sector and aiming to create smarter and more inclusive cities. So, let's go! Welcome to Engines of Creation, Gurpreet. I'm really happy to have you here, and I'm sure this episode is going to be fantastic with a lot of interesting things.
First, I want to say thank you for inviting me for the podcast. I think it's a bit of a privilege coming to speak to you. Obviously, we've known each other for a while it's almost 10 years ago, I think, since we started working Conical Malta. But I am now the Chief Data and Technology Officer in Westminster City Council. The council, for people who don't really know London itself, there's two main cities in there, City of London and City of Westminster. But it is made up of a lot of boroughs. That's, all the iconic areas. So that's and that's why I kind of joined. But before then, I've always been in tech data for, all of my career transformation. But I might typically come through a more, transformation, product development, sort of go-to-market routes rather than the traditional CIO, space. And I've worked in a number of different industries, from telecoms to utilities to manufacturing. And obviously, when we were in Conical Malta, it was advanced technology manufacturing, which was a great experience. And finally, now in public sector, where I've been here roughly about 2.5 years.
I always love to have guests who have such a breadth of experience. And I think it's very interesting, in particular, when you have so many, you can see and compare across so many industries and so many verticals, and somebody says, because it really gives sort of this very, very, very broad view. So let's start though from the end and from your experience now as a local authority. And so how hard is it to innovate in a local authority and in a public authority? Anecdotally, we hear that it sounds really hard, but on the other hand, I also hear a lot of interesting things going on.
Yeah, I think if I start possibly first talking about what attracted me to, Westminster, is really around, I think when I was looking for a new role, thinking where should I go next in my career, I always knew that I wanted to go somewhere where there's a lot of innovation. So, the green sector, sort of autonomous cars, some, industry 4.0, those types of areas. And I think one key one that stood out was actually smart cities and the potential that local authorities and governments and public organizations have because of the breadth of impact and the opportunities that they have in there, all the way from, if I take climate change, that's going to be solved in the cities, which is a real big challenge for a lot of sort of administrations. If you think about, I suppose, more in the UK, housing, that's also local authorities. You think about repairs and asset management, but also the people in there, which is vulnerable people, could be vulnerable, or people who need additional support. That's all really linked with local authorities as well. And then, there's a whole physical infrastructure that the local authorities manage. In Westminster, we have roughly around 90 billion pounds worth of physical assets that we manage. So I think the potential for innovation in public organizations, especially local authorities, is immense. So obviously when I joined, there's a big focus on smart cities, and the early iteration of smart cities was really around tech-led. So you heard about Google setting up, smart cities, prototypes or innovations, and trying to carve out space on what the future of a city could look like. I think that's moved on really to understand actually we need to build smart cities around people, the services, improvements. So I think there's a massive potential. Now, the other side of your question was, how hard is it? Now, obviously, innovation needs a certain type of person, a certain mindset. And I think it's sometimes viewed as actually you need a lot of people to do a lot of things. Local authorities and public sector are constrained by budgets, especially now in the current economic cycle. You hear about public services, creaking at the edges, all the way from the NHS to housing and local authorities going bust as well. But I think you can really still deliver a lot of innovation if you have the right types of skills, people, resources, and talent. It doesn't have to be a lot, but it does have to be, people who are almost innovators and entrepreneurs, but want to take that challenge in local authority because it can have a real impact on society and people.
I like the way you framed it from the point of view of people and as the key enabler for innovation. And I completely agree with you from this perspective that in the end, whatever you do in an industry it's really the people that drives you and drive the innovation. And it's the mindset and the attitude and the culture that really can create this opportunity. Of course, the budget helps, but sometimes there are places where actually budget constraints can push for more innovation than not. So going a little bit down in this sort of rabbit hole of the enabler of innovation. So you talked about people. So what are the other key elements of enabling innovation? I'm saying particularly in a local authority. Maybe we can talk about more broadly about other industries, but starting from this local authority experience, people, and what are the others?
Obviously opportunities. And I think your point about cost as a pressure for innovation is actually a really good point, because a lot of innovation can drive productivity within the organization. So I think there is this view around, obviously, budgets are needed. Let's face it, any technology project you ever do, you do need budget. But I think having that starting small and prototyping and showing the art of the possible, so showing, not telling, is the key here around creating ideas of innovation, but making them almost tangible, not scaled out, not, you can't use these out everywhere, but it's that kind of seeding the thought of the art of the possible with those solutions. So I think technology budgets, even a little bit of seed funding is required there. Opportunities to understand and spot sort of where innovation, whether it's IoT, AI, automation can help. I think that's the other angle of it. And I think the final one is processes. So what are the barriers and the, hurdles you have to go through to get, working prototypes and so innovations built? I think processes are probably the biggest thing because, most organizations are structured in a very hierarchical, bureaucratic way. There's a lot of administration you need. Sometimes you just want to have the agility to the speed to just get coding and develop those products and services that can make a big difference and, and take advantage of the opportunities, whether it's cost reduction or growth or service or customer experience. So I think in summary, people by far the largest, right? Without the right, and it's not just about an individual, it's about the right culture as well in there. And the culture then leads on to the processes, which leads on to obviously the budgets, which leads also to, the type of technology and the partners you work with.
And what about the end users, the citizens? How do you factor them in? I assume they're a critical component, but are they more an enabler or they slow things down? How do you play with the fact that they are not just buyers? I don't know, maybe in a way they are, but they are citizens. So in that sense, they are voting for the council. The interaction is completely different from any other industry, I would say.
Yeah.
So in the way you engage with the end users. So how does this play out?
I think one of the experiences that we built when we were at Konica Minolta was really around that human-centered design, really understanding design thinking, service design. And I remember going to a module as part of my MBA in Helsinki and understanding how end users are really integral in terms of co-creating opportunities. And I think if I fast forward to where we are now, I think it's literally critical. So we've launched a real innovative product called Report It, where it uses AI for image classification. It has a chat button there, which has a large language model on there. So it may, so the barriers of, I guess, submitting reports or issues in the to the council has been reduced. So a lot of the form filling, the AI takes care of because it abstracts the information required rather than you having to fill it in. That was all built based on user feedback, citizen feedback. So what were the pain points? How can we test the prototypes and the wireframes to say, does this make a market difference in terms of their experience? Because really it's about iterating that value proposition. We're going to all have assumptions at the start, but the earlier you can test those assumptions with citizens, the better products and outcomes you tend to get, I think. And Report It is a great example of that. It wasn't the only source of, I guess, input in terms of how the product would develop. Obviously, we have to look at internally as customers as well. So, where do we get all our calls from? What are the big things that people phone about, whether it's potholes or dumped rubbish or other sort of issues within the city. So I think citizens definitely are a big player in determining the direction and the experiences that we need to kind of cultivate and build. I guess the challenge is when you talk about, in private sector businesses, you always do segmentation. In cities, the segmentation is a lot more complex because there's a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different sort of demographics across the council and cities themselves. So I think that becomes more challenging. But I don't think that's a negative thing. I think it just provides a richer base of information and knowledge, which you can then, exploit. I think there's always a view that, there's a customer pull model where, we speak to citizens, we speak to customers, they determine, what they might need and we might spot opportunities. But the other thing that we're looking at internally is around probably a little bit of technology push, especially around what, the rapid change in AI, sensors, IoT, that type, combining those types of capabilities together, what they can do internally as well. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's never an or decision. It's what scale do we take input from which parameter of, I guess, either citizens' internal data, hard data, quantified data, qualitative data.
How does it work with the feedback loop? You mentioned about segmentation and of course sort of which can be very, very broad. And I find it interesting in a way because often when you think it from the perspective of, how can I say, an industrial design or industrial product development, sometimes it's more about finding the right niche and in a way finding the right customers and finding this product market fit. In the case of public authority, the citizens are there, they're not going anywhere, and you need to do something that actually helps as many as possible, I assume. And on the other hand, they're also very close. So how can you test your hypothesis across this very large, potentially number of different cases? But on the other hand, you have the opportunity to have them very close. So I think you can have possibly fast iteration, I would assume. So how does it play out?
Yeah, I think it depends on the opportunity. So the reported one is something that probably all citizens are interested in because, if they spot something that's an issue in the city, they want to report it as quick as possible. But even when you look at a city, I think we do broadly classify, obviously, citizens and residents. We have obviously a lot of businesses as well, which, are based in Westminster. So that's another sort of grouping of customers, for a better term. And then we have a lot of tourists, but also for people who commute into Westminster for work. So there are some really broad level segmentations. We do run a city survey where basically we start to really understand the demographics of the population within the city itself. We do have different types of lenses that we apply to determine what type of opportunity and who should we contact. So it depends because obviously there are some services that are applicable to everyone. And so you can get a random sample size of people and as long as it's representative, it kind of our needs in terms of understanding needs. On the other side, where we talk about housing, vulnerability, that's a lot more nuanced and a lot more difficult. So I think it comes back to also the point you made earlier, right? Where do you innovate? It may be easier to innovate where it's not so complex first, And then looking at the people side of it, where we talk about vulnerability, because you can have vulnerability from learning disabilities, children, financial, and all sorts of other sort of parameters. And that is more challenging, because how do you do the classification of those and how do you meet those needs is a bit more challenging. And I think the thing that we have to do is try and abstract out to say actually what would be the thing that would help people by and large, without neglecting that actually everyone's an individual, because we have to take care of every citizen, not just communities and the broader population.
Now, taking a broader lens, looking at innovation in a public authority and council, or could be even in civil service. So what are for you the areas that are where there is the highest potential for innovation?
So I think local authorities and obviously cities are, probably some of the most complex sort of structures we have in our society, right? And if you look at, I guess, areas of innovation, clearly some of the strategic objectives that all sort of local authorities or cities have at the moment is climate. How do they adapt to climate change? Because we all know that that's actually going to happen. And you see the hurricanes in Florida even this week, where, they're saying the severity of the hurricane has increased because of warmer temperatures. London's particularly, obviously there's a lot of, we're on the Thames, we're on the river. It's quite a flat place. So I think there's a lot of innovation and opportunities for innovation around that problem. Because, when there's a couple of more degree, when it gets warmer, we're expecting, the city to get warmer over the next, decades or so. With the warmer temperatures and the extreme heat, it probably affects footfall. Footfall then affects obviously the economy, and which obviously then affects obviously revenue as well. But on the other side, the increased temperatures will also affect, vulnerable people in terms of heat and coping with heat or extreme cold. And that presents then another challenge in terms of then how do you adapt and cater for, adapt the city to take that into account? Do we plant more trees? Do we plant more coverage, and how do we greening happen? So I think that the climate's one area, net zero, air quality, etc., which obviously then have ramifications on health. So it's all kind of linked. The other area I think we've got is around housing and social housing. You hear in the UK, that's a big issue for not just local government, but for central government as well. Housing again. How can we, move from a reactive model where, something breaks down and only then you contact the council, to moving to a more proactive model to say, actually, we know something might need proactive maintenance. So taking some of those industrial sort of practices, moving from reactive to sort of proactive and even prescriptive maintenance of those assets. So, maybe we can put a sensor on a boiler where the vibration starts to change. We think you might need a little bit of maintenance before it breaks down. But also, damp and mold was a big thing in housing. So and we've got an experiment with one of my colleagues, David, who's leading on this, with other local authorities within London around damp and mold sensors. So heat and humidity. How can we, put those sensors in people's home to detect where there is a risk of humidity and leading to more mold, and therefore prevent that happening before it actually happens, because we know, actually damp, mold was attributed to a death as well. So it's not just about managing the asset, because we know that maintenance and the repair job will be higher, but it's also preventing health issues as well. So I think there's a whole opportunity around housing and how we can change the model around housing. And probably that still applies to, I suspect, people services. How do we use data, and analytics and insights to tailor our services to support people better, both in who have disabilities or have other types of vulnerabilities, because ultimately it was all about, prioritizing resources, and these innovations can help you to manage greater volumes, but without necessarily increasing the resource profiles, and cost of the services dramatically.
Again, thinking from an industrial background, how these innovations have such a direct impact on people's life It feels like you can touch it. And also sometimes I feel it's easier to find motivation in a way, because if they work, you can clearly show the benefit, or you can clearly see the benefit of what the work you're doing.
I think that's right. And I think actually there's quite often secondary benefits as well, which are unintended, and which we didn't know. So, I mentioned the damp mold, pilot that we're running. There's 10 sensors. One of the sensors was actually reading a little bit higher, and we weren't sure why. It turned out basically it wasn't damp mold. It was just basically the sensor was put near a radiator or a heat source. So it was reading, the temperature was always reading a little bit higher. But I think the feedback from the resident when somebody did come and check was actually, that's a really nice thing to do, to come out and actually be proactive and just check up if everything's okay. So I think that was a secondary benefit, rather than, okay, there's no damp mold, but having somebody just there to say, actually, how are things? Is everything okay? I think that reassurance was a secondary benefit that was which I thought was quite inspiring. So that's why I think sometimes you look at the ROI, especially in public sector, the ROI is not so clear. Is there a massive financial return? I mean, how do you put a financial return on somebody who says, actually, thank you for coming to check on me, who's elderly, living by themselves? So yeah, so I think that is the benefit of actually working at the local level, at the local authority level, because you are really have a direct impact on people, and you have that direct sort of feedback loop. And you also have the resources that can make a difference when it's needed.
Yeah, I found very interesting your comment about ROI. Okay. There is maybe a slightly political point here, hopefully not too controversial, that historically there has been this tendency to move the management of public authorities like they were businesses. But interestingly enough, actually, if you look from a business perspective, more and more we talk about the social impact in businesses and so forth, because there is a realization that if you run things only looking for money, you don't necessarily get the best effects and the best consequences of your work. And I think public authorities showed that very well, because if you work with people and you want to serve people, a lot of things you can't measure them in money. I mean, or not that easily. Maybe as a secondary, tertiary effect of, if somebody feels better, my work can contribute more to society. Yeah, maybe, but that's not why you're doing it. And I think that's very important.
That's an interesting point, isn't it? Because I think I sometimes I live in Birmingham, and obviously here we have Cadbury's, and you look at Bourneville Village, which was basically set up as a village farm Cadbury's for the employees. And I just wonder whether, obviously, that whole shareholder value change shifted the perception of what businesses actually, how they help, their work as a society. And I guess, so I guess there was always a little bit. And I think maybe now the tendency, I think you're right, for a lot of private organizations to think about the environmental, societal impacts that they have and how they can contribute as well. I mean, certainly whenever we engage with any private sector, it's, what is a social value impact that they can sort of support us on and provide. So, yeah, but I think sometimes we, and this is where I think there is a big difference between public and private sector. We may have to invest earlier on because of, I guess, not a clear ROI, but we know there is an impact on people and communities. And therefore the business case has to take into much more societal impact as well, not just commercial. I mean, I think, budgeting is really important. And I think if we can, as innovators, help costs within the organization on your P&L in terms of better asset management, being more proactive, because we know proactive generally has a less cost of repairs, overall. I think you still have to mind. Yeah, you still have to do that. I think you can't just say money doesn't matter. And I think local authorities who have had financial difficulties proves that cannot be the case as well.
Very good point. Thanks. I like how you sort of close the circle talking, okay, there are other things. And of course, you can't forget money on the other end. It needs to be everything together, resources and so on. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Staying on the civic innovation space, but we had recently, as another guest to the podcast, Claudia Schwalitz, who's the CEO of Democracy Next, and they work a lot into civic innovation, but more from the decision-making perspective. So in that specific case, it's basically civic assemblies and citizen assemblies as a support to the political decision-making, because it's becoming, you mentioned about the fact that public structure are probably the most complex structures we have in society. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for public authorities to make decisions because these decisions are very complex sometimes. And bringing citizens into the decision-making process, not only via elections, but more often, it is a way for innovation. I just wonder if it's something you also looked at over these last couple of years, more from the point of view of decision-making and political processes, or not.
Yeah, actually, it's really interesting. We were at a sort of a leadership away day, and one of the things that was talked about in there was about the concept of co-creation, especially with communities and their representatives. And that was really around making sure that they're involved in the entire decision-making process from start to finish, not just consulted at the start and then presented at the end, but they are part of that sort of decision-making process. And interestingly, there are areas of the organization, Westminster's really progressive in terms of trying to bring external perspectives into why we should do, why the decisions we make are the decisions we make and how they then support input from the communities. And that kind of collaboration or way of working is also seeping into procurement. So having communities and their representatives on when we are procuring new capabilities, I think that's something that we're starting to look at as an organization. We're looking at obviously how when we appoint certain roles, how they get involved in that recruitment process as well. So I think this whole concept of co-creation is something that we're trying to really start driving. And, and I think the course of moving forward in this year, it would really be about actually getting some of that to drive our roadmaps in terms of technology. Obviously, you have to choose where it applies. If we're going to build a new data warehouse to manage IoT and, streaming data and so on, that's probably not the right place because that is really technical. Unless we get technical inputs, that's fine. But where there's probably, what do we do with a certain space? How do we regenerate a specific area? How do we focus on some of the schools or some of the other, businesses around their wastes, crime? That I think is definitely where we want to create services. But there are outward facing services digital services that we create. And I certainly think as part of that process, why shouldn't, citizens be involved in some of our show and tells? And then they can say, actually, well, if you did X, Y, and Z, that could, that might make it a bit better and feed that into the next iteration of development. I think we will get there. We're not quite there yet. I think we are part of our journey towards that co-creation sort of model. But I guess the thing that I would say is digital innovation, in which I work in, we're kind of only 2.5, 3 years, in its inception. So the last couple of years, it's all been about establishment. But moving forward, it's going to be really about scaling out and engagement and how do we get that input in.
I really love to hear this story about co-creation. It's really, I love the concept, and especially applied in a public environment, in interaction between the public authority and the citizen. Okay, I wanted to open up the landscape and thinking from your perspective of all the different industries worked into over the last years across all your career, actually. And if you compare all the different experiences you had to the last experience in a public authority, I would have probably two questions. One is more, what was most helpful of your previous experiences that into this current one? And maybe the other question would be more sort of the other way around. Okay, now that you know all the things you know, what would you do differently?
The things that have helped me, I think one is the breadth of experience. So working in different sectors has really, I guess, every role you take is a learning opportunity. Every project you do is a new learning opportunity. And I think having the breadth of working in different industries on different initiatives has really helped. It helped, I guess, understand the various elements of, local authorities, which basically are combine a number of different industries together, so from, managing physical assets to, services to even, sales when we have a lot of registrars, services, etc. So I think that breadth really does help understand, where sort of, I guess, technology, data, AI, innovation can be applied. So I think that's one of the key things. I think the other one was probably the ways of working as well. So, I've been working in agile since, I don't know, all my career, basically, spanning, and that was even before, there was a concept of scaled or enterprise level agile operating models. And I think that flexibility, iteration, pace, understanding priorities and backlogs, and understanding actually projects don't just end when you've delivered the first drop. There's always a roadmap to do things. I think that's also helped. And I think finally, the other point is probably quite comfortable in working in ambiguity and matrix ways as well. So there's two things: ambiguity in terms of where are we going, what are we doing, and how do we help, and what does it mean to the organization and customers, but also other stakeholders. I should say stakeholders. But then the other side was it really around, always working in, not in a hierarchy. And I think that really does help in terms of delivering innovation. So I think those are the elements I would say that have helped me where I am now. And I think they will probably be applied most other places as well, because they're quite, transferable experience. I think where the change has been in moving from private to public has really been around, I guess, obviously in the private sector, it's all about the bottom line or the revenue or some sort of, return on investment. So it makes decision making a little bit easier. Obviously, you also have to apply judgment in everything you do. But I think there is a little bit more sort of, how do we prioritize the things that we need to do? In Westminster, and I suspect this is, how do you allocate the resources and the financing and the budgets you have across all of the things which are important? So is climate change any less important than, managing the city's infrastructure, from potholes and repairs to housing, to providing services like registrars or even libraries? And I think that prioritization is a challenge that we have. And it's not a clear case of ranking A to Z, 1 to 10. There is judgment that needs to be applied, and better, I guess, way of allocating pots of resources to each of these areas in different proportions. And I think that judgment is quite difficult.
Especially this difference in prioritization, I think it's key. It's probably the other side, of some of the other things we discussed earlier as a positive. It also makes it harder, though, to prioritize. No.
It does this, especially when you're a centralized sort of service, as digital innovation, technology, sort of, how do you say, well, that project takes a priority over this project? And I think that is fundamentally, and there's always a little bit of friction. There will always be friction because we don't have finite amount of resources. And so we have to make priority calls. We have to make sort of, trade-offs. But how do we know we're making the sensible trade-offs, and where and when is the thing that, I suppose, comes with experience, I suspect, more than anything else.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Experience usually helps. Okay, so let's move, I think, to the last question now then. So what are the characteristics of a leader who embraces complexity? I think
I've mentioned this before. I think you have to deal with ambiguity, right? I think one of the things probably, and I've reflected on this, I think when I was a lot younger, I used to do a lot of art, and I kind of picked it up and, painting and drawing and so on. And I think when you have complexity, one of the things that you have to apply is, how do these complex areas fit together on a canvas? So can you paint a picture where it represents each element of that complexity? And paintings are, I think, a great metaphor for this, because they are complex. They always have a little bit, different details, from brush strokes to the blending to different parts of the painting that you might get. And I think complexity, creativity go hand in hand. So I think to deal with complexity, you have to be quite creative as well. So as well as, being ambiguous, you have to kind of almost draw your pictures out, say what element of the complexity really is important. So how do you abstract from the detail to the bigger picture, I think is a trait that I think needs to be practiced and built. I think just going back to the painting, quite often whenever I've started, it's usually a blank canvas, but it's like, oh, but we want to go somewhere. But how do you draw and start sketching out what that canvas actually entails? Is a process of understanding the complexity that you're living in. And I suppose that's why I think I've been quite comfortable being in that space, because I enjoy the freedom. I think you have to enjoy the freedom of not knowing all the answers all the time, but also the journey to get to some clarity. I think that is also, I think, a privilege. I think sometimes that can be a challenge for people, but then I think it's a different type of challenge.
The painter metaphor is okay. It's probably going up to my top list of answers. Definitely.
Oh, right. Okay.
It's very powerful, and it's interesting because we tend to think of complexity, of course, in our sector. In general, of course, with the more, how can I say, a scientific mind. But I love actually this element of embracing ambiguity from a perspective of creation and the journey you make. Thanks a lot for sharing that. So, and I think that goes perfectly this conversation and this interview. So thanks a lot, Gurpreet, for being here with us and sharing your insight. And yeah, it was a great conversation.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you for the invite, and it's a pleasure talking.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Engines of Creation. I hope you enjoyed this in-depth exploration of innovation in local authorities with Gurpreet. We explored how digital transformation and data-driven approaches can improve public services and how leadership can address the challenges of complexity in the public sector. If you enjoyed this episode, you might want to look at other conversations about innovation in the public space, like the ones with Claudia Schwalitz and Karsten Lumbier. And of course, if you want to learn more, make sure to follow Engines of Creation, and please leave us a rating and a review. And don't hesitate to share this episode on social media and with friends and colleagues who might be interested. This podcast counts on you to grow and help other people to understand and embrace complexity, to innovate and create. If you have any questions, comments or feedback, feel free to reach out to enginesofcreation@mastrodonato.co. I'll be happy to continue the conversation with you. Engines of Creation will be back soon with a new episode. Stay tuned for more stimulating conversations on complexity, innovation, and leadership.